Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Connecting the Dots. Joining me on this one is Shari Berg, a journalist turned copywriter and content strategist from all the way over in Pennsylvania. Shari, thank you so much for joining me today, and it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Neil. I look forward to talking with you.
We have such a similar career path. It's crazy. So when I reached out to you and we got talking and you agreed to come on the podcast, I knew this was going to be a perfect podcast. So Shari is here today to talk about how journalistic skills can help copywriters stand out in the age of AI. I'm sure there'll be plenty of copywriters who don't have a background in journalism and will be really keen to hear what she has to say. So Shari, we're going to come on to explore the career of Shari the journalist and copywriter. And I know you'll have a lot of interesting things to talk about, but I think the best place to start is by exploring you, Shari the human. So, in a nutshell, what's your story?
Well, as I say on I think I say on my LinkedIn profile, I've always wanted to be a writer since I was old enough to hold a pen. There was just something about writing that captivated me. And as I got older, I started to think, how can I use, this love of writing to make a living?
Mhm.
And it wasn't until about, I think, the 10th grade when I got introduced to the school newspaper in high school that I was like, oh, journalism just might be the thing for me. And that's kind of how I ended up on that track toward journalism.
And so you got started at quite a young age, because I remember we have a paper over in the UK called The Independent, and I remember reading the sports pages of that paper when I was about 14 or 15, and I was really into football, well, soccer, but really we call it football. It's the real football, no offense. But I started reading that, and I was really interested in that. But you started at a really young age, so that's really cool. So it's something you've always wanted to do. And if we go right back to the beginning of your foray into journalism, I mean, you've already kind of answered the question there, but can you expand on that a little bit and talk about when you first started writing and when you thought, this whole newspaper thing is for me?
It's funny because I was actually writing a lot about American football, the other football, because I was a statistician for my high school football team. So I was at every game. It was an ideal opportunity. I understood football. So I was their sports reporter. So I kind of got my start reporting on sports. It wasn't really keen on it. I liked football, so I liked that part of it. But then I kind of dabbled a little bit more in feature writing and news writing, and I decided I really liked feature writing more than hard news.
Mhm.
Just I think typically because hard news is often bad news, and nobody really likes to deal with that. But the feature stories just gave me an opportunity to do what I like to do best as a journalist, and even now as a content strategist. And it's just to get to know the story of people that I'm talking to or brands that I'm working with. And I think that's the format that I just love the most as a journalist.
You are so right about, did you say hard news is bad news? I want to make sure I quote
Yeah.
you. Yeah. So the amount of murder cases and arson attacks and legal stories I wrote about that were just really, they were great for me because they helped my career. I got a lot of front pages out of that, but they were just really, really depressing.
Yeah.
I don't know how bad the pothole situation is over in the US, but I imagine it's, yeah. So I remember submitting a freedom of information request and finding out that the local council had spent £1 million in 1 year on fixing potholes, and yet there were potholes everywhere. So that wasn't too much fun. But yeah, the feature writing, I wish I'd got to do more of that. And to be honest, when I look back on my career, I wish I'd put my hands up for more things like that, because I know that's something that you've specialized in for a long time, something you've really enjoyed. Actually, I want to go a little bit off piste here. Could you tell the viewers about some feature articles that you were writing in the aftermath of the Donald Trump assassination attempt? Were they feature articles, am I right in saying?
Yeah, they were. They were somewhere between that
Yeah.
news and feature because their full-time staff was reporting on that were at the rally. They were reporting on the hard news angles. But what I was dealing with, one of the things that was pretty cool was I got to talk to the medical team at the local hospital that
Mhm.
treated him.
Mhm.
It got to get the story behind that, what they were thinking. And it wasn't, most journalists were calling them and saying, tell us about his injuries. Tell us about, like, they wanted that inside scoop.
Yeah.
Me, I wanted to know how they felt, how they prepared, what it meant for other patients at the hospital. I mean, they basically kicked everybody out. The Secret Service locked the place down. So it was a really cool story to be able to talk to them and just see how they were feeling. And I mean, that's really what that's really what feature stories are about. And that's at the heart of journalism. And you want to know how whatever you're writing about impacts the people who are reading about it. So
Yeah.
that was a pretty cool story.
And I think what you've exhibited there, and I think it's, it's a testament to how great you are as a journalist and also as a copywriter. And we'll come on to talk about the overlap between each discipline. But what you've done there is you've looked for the sources less explored, I suppose, as well. And you've thought, well, what angles can I uncover that someone else may not have done? Where can I get first world insights that are really pertinent to the story, but actually may have been overlooked by some major news outlets? I think what you've done there, because I would really want to read that. That's the kind of thing I would want to read, rather than someone who's in the crowd, because everyone's already done that 1,000 times. So actually, to hear what happened in the aftermath, I think that's a really great angle. And I think the best journalists have a knack for that. They don't just kind of go, well, that's the story. We have a few eyewitness accounts from in the crowd. You've gone above and beyond and thought, no, I want to dig a bit deeper here.
Yeah.
And I really like that example. And that actually ties in really well with the next question. I suppose that would be one, but what other core copywriting principles did you learn during your time in journalism, or are you still learning now?
Definitely keeping things brief and to the point. Copywriting, you hear all the time people say clear and concise, which doesn't really tell you much about, I mean, what does that mean, right? But as a journalist, I didn't need anybody to explain that to me, because I know what it means. You're writing sometimes on deadline. You're given so many column inches to squeeze an entire story into. So you have to learn how to eliminate all that fluff. So that was one of the biggest benefits, I think, and one of the biggest lessons that translated from my journalism career into copywriting. Just was a natural progression.
As you told that story, I had to stop myself laughing, because I remember when I was studying to be a journalist, we have a qualification in the UK called the NCTJ. I think it's the National Centre for the Training of Journalists or something like that. It's a nationally recognised qualification, and most qualified journalists have to have it these days. And I always remember the reporting exam. So we would get given a brief on something that had happened. It would be like, dog stuck up tree, or local community centre catches fire, or something like that. And then we basically had to come up with a story off the back of it, but we had to select which angles were the most interesting, because sometimes you would have 4 or 5 angles that could quite conceivably be the most interesting part of it. And so he was really funny, this guy. He was from Manchester. I don't know, you won't know Manchester, but it's the accent is very distinctive. And we were typing away, and he's walking over and observing our screens. And he was really, really nice guy, really funny. But then he would say, Neil, it's good, but it's not right. And he'd like laugh, and he'd basically be so brutal about it that we had to like chop out so much of what we wrote. So what would happen was, this was like just the mock exam. This wasn't even the real thing. The real thing was even more brutal than this, but he had prepared us so well for it. We would write the story, and then it would go up on the screen. So he would show everyone's stories to the room, and we would all critique each other's work. And it was really brutal. Like, I remember writing a sentence that was like 20 words long, really important detail that I felt. And he was like, oh, it's good, but it's not right. And he crossed it out, put a cross right through it. He went, you're going to have to do it again. So I had to do it again. And it was like, but do you know what? It made me such a better writer. It really did. It was like, I remember another tutor actually on that course, and I'm not going to take up the whole podcast by talking about this course, but another tutor on the course said, if your sentence is more than 25 words long, start rewriting. If it's more than 40 words long, start panicking. And I've carried that advice with me ever since. Like, I remember, or it was start worrying. That's the same thing. When he said that, that stuck with me so much. And I've carried that with me. Obviously, there's times where, depending on the audience that I'm writing for or the sector, I will write slightly longer sentences. But if I get over 25 words, even to this day, I'm still highlighting the sentence and going, oh, it's 27 words long, and that transpires in how I write my LinkedIn posts. And I guess it must be the same for you. You're like, oh, I've got to get the most important thing front and center. I've got to get that teaser copy at the top, and I've got to make sure the sentences are all written in active voice and that they're no more than 25 words long and they don't have too many adjectives or adverbs. Oh God. Anyway, I don't even know what point I'm trying to make. Basically, journalism teaches you to be brutal with writing, which is just a long-winded way of what you said, which is a bit ironic, really, isn't it? But yeah.
Well, yeah, one of the things that I learned was, if you have the word "and" in your sentence,
Yeah.
that's where you need to chop it off and start a new sentence.
Yeah.
because you're trying to join two thoughts that they might be related, but they don't need to be all crammed in one sentence. And so probably if you look when you get to those, 40-word sentences, there's probably more than one and in there that could be,
I mean, yeah, it's
one sentence.
this is so I don't think we have anything written down for this in the questions, or I didn't prepare anything, but sometimes I feel like journalism can go a little bit too far the other way, because I will also use an Oxford comma and then say and have a second kind of part of a sentence or a second clause or whatever.
Mhm.
That's where it's kind of like, yeah, I get it. I get the 20-word sentence thing, but at the same time, some thoughts can't be expressed in fewer than 20 words. But like, but I tell you what, it's a really, really good grounding. That's what I would say. Like, what was that like for you? Did you have reporting exams as part? I guess you must have done as part of your. On.
Not really reporting exams, but my journalism professor in college worked in the business for 30 years. So he was brutal to begin with. I think I've told the story on my LinkedIn page where the very first paper I ever wrote for him, he wrote at the top, "You may want to consider another career."
What?
Yeah. So anybody who knows me knows that I got upset at first, and then I thought, challenge accepted, dude. I'm going to show you. And I did, but
Wow.
that was like a real harsh wake up call for me, but it was also a kick in the pants. And I kind of needed that. But he would send us to cover things in our local community. We covered municipal meetings. We would go and cover college board meetings, whatever was going on that was news or like a feature. He sent us out. So we got on the job training while we were still in college. And that was some of the best experience I think that I could have gotten, more
Mm,
so than just like taking a test. Because you can take a test and get all the right answers, but until you actually practice it, what
mm,
you've learned in a real life situation, you'll never know if you can cut it until you do it.
yeah.
So that was brutal, because there were a lot of times that I went to municipal meetings here, and these little tiny town councils, sometimes they'd get really heated, and you'd be like, whoa, how do I handle that
Mhm.
when you're still learning? So it was quite an experience, and I'm thankful for it, because I think it really prepared me for the real world when I graduated.
Oh, I had a few of those. Don't worry. I had a few town council meetings. I had a few area forum meetings. Oh my God, they were the best stories though. You come
Hmm.
away thinking, I have just got some golden nuggets. I would go to some area forum meetings when I was a journalist and could get 4 or 5 stories out of just an hour meeting. And it's funny when you tell that story about your professor, because I had something similar when I was training to be a journalist in Manchester. I made a mistake in an article, and the guy, I think his name was David, and he was a real asshole. Like he really was. And he highlighted my name in an email in bold to about 30 people. Like he just embarrassed me in front of everyone. Like, because basically what there was at the time, there was a news cohort and a sport cohort. We were in the news training cohort, so there were about 5 or 6 of us. In the sport training cohort, there were about 30. So there were about 35 people on this email thread. And he just embarrassed me. He just said, "This is completely unacceptable, blah, blah, blah." And I remember, right, that's fucking challenge accepted. I'm going to fucking show you now. I'm going to show you. And you know what? I was so angry with what he wrote that I turned up early every day after that. Like my timekeeping, as you know, from jumping on the podcast today, not always the best, but like even though it wasn't to do with my timekeeping, it just fueled me up so much. It made me really want to prove him wrong. So I was in before him every day after that, pretty much, like apart from the odd day here and there. And I got some really good stories, got loads of like exclusive stories, managed to get a job straight out of journalism college. And even when I first started as a journalist, there were people there who were just frankly horrible to me, the way that they treated me, some of the editors. But it gives you really thick skin. And I've got to say, whenever a client comes back with negative feedback, and thankfully from my experience, that's not happened an awful lot since I've gone freelance, but you're a bit like, do your worst, because it's never, I don't know about you, but it's never going to be as bad as what you get in journalism. I mean, if someone is literally writing you should consider another career, it's kind of like, well, any piece of feedback after that is going to be like pleasant and
Absolutely.
nice to,
Yeah.
yeah. But okay, so when did you make the transition into copywriting for business, if that's the appropriate word to use?
It was around 2005. My son was born, and it didn't take me very long to realize that being a journalist was not going to be compatible with being a mom. All the weird hours and, late nights, going to meetings all the time. It was not how I wanted to spend my time when he was so young. So I thought, well, now what can I do with my writing skills? So it was a moment of truth for me. And I fumbled around for a little bit trying to work it out. I just started freelancing at first, with different outlets, media outlets. And then it just eventually transitioned into that content strategy and content writing. And then people started asking me about, well, can you do ads and, can you do sales stuff? And so it just gradually progressed over like the first 2 or 3 years when I made that transition. And now I'm kind of full on into it. And it's, I'm pretty invested in it at this point.
Because I remember for me, I moved into public relations after being in journalism, and it kind of felt like I wouldn't say I got into it by accident, but it wasn't something that I was sure I would do for an awfully long time. I think, like, I don't know how you felt, but my heart was still in journalism in a lot of ways. The only thing with journalism was just the money was so bad. Like, that was part of the reason why I got out of there.
Yes.
I never really, I don't know about you, but I never really meant to do this for an awfully long time. And then here we are, like 10 years later, I don't know, it just seems to kind of transpire that way.
Yeah. I dabbled in PR a little bit too. One of my clients, that's what they wanted was PR. And they were looking for people who were former journalists to fill that role because they knew we would understand the media side of it. And I really didn't like it, to be honest with you. I did it for, oh gosh, 8 or 9 years. And it just was, it was a whole different level of stress. And you're right, it's very counter to what you do as a journalist, because now you're on the other side and you have to present things from a very different angle and a different viewpoint when you're in PR than versus when you're the reporter trying to get the story. So it wasn't for me. I was happy when I kind of hung that up and said, this isn't for me. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm just going to focus on content strategy and copywriting. And that's pretty much where I plan to stay, because it's a sweet spot. It lets me use my journalism skills, and it lets me use my love of writing and dealing with people and learning people's stories. So I think it's just it's a good fit.
Yeah. I'm curious at this point, when you moved into copywriting and the experience you've had in public relations as well, how did you find the review process? Because I remember when I moved from journalism into public relations, what I thought made a great story was completely different to what someone who'd worked in public relations for 20 or 30 years thought made a great story. And actually, when I then went into copywriting and content writing, then it changed again. So, like, I'm only talking from my personal experience here, but I find that journalism makes you very matter of fact about things, whereas in copywriting and content writing, there's quite a lot of nuance, and you can be a little bit more flowery, I think, or a little, you can delve a little bit deeper in some context. I mean, how did you find it?
Yeah, it's very different. You have to tell a little bit more of a story, so you have a little bit more leeway.
Yeah.
You're not writing that got 15 column inches and 20 minutes to write it. You're not in that situation, so it's a little bit different. And so that was my experience as well. But for me, the type of clients that I was working with, they were educational organizations, and so they had a whole different standard for how they wanted their content to be, and unfortunately, it could be very dry. So I was always pushing back. You can be educational and interesting at the same time. Like, you don't have to bore your reader. So that part of me, I was always pushing back on that. And sometimes they listened to me, sometimes they didn't. But that was one thing that I discovered as well, is that the PR writing, it depended on the organization that you were doing it for, and what type of style that you ended up with.
Yeah, I was very surprised by the amount of red tape that there was. I was just like, oh my God. I mean, I worked for an insurance company, and the amount of copy that had to go through legal.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God. I just want to tell a story. And okay, I don't want to cost the company thousands or millions of pounds, but I mean, come on. Anyway, that's a story for another time.
Yeah.
So in your LinkedIn strapline, you describe yourself as a relationship builder. So how do you go about building relationships, and why is it so important for copywriters to build close relationships that go beyond transactional everyday encounters?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't really, you hear a lot of copywriters talking about brand voice. Oh, you got to get brand voice right. You can't get a brand voice right if you don't talk to the people behind the brand.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, I don't send in them a DM on LinkedIn saying, oh, hey, you want to buy my services? Or, something else that's, just one of those pitch slapping DMs. You have to take the time to get to know why they're excited about the business, why they're excited about their role in the business, get to know them as a person too. I've often found, that journalist in me, I'm asking that who, what, where, when, why, and how, which includes, tell me about the who behind somebody, behind an organization. People may have very interesting side stories that you can work into their brand story in ways that, help personalize them and help people connect with them. So if you're not having regular conversations, if you're not just sitting down and getting to know someone, I don't think you can effectively represent their brand with content.
No. And there are a lot of people who would be quite tentative about doing that, about sitting down and building relationships. As I said before, copywriters who don't have that experience in journalism, who don't know the right questions to ask, which we're obviously going to come on to later on. But yeah, they might have a little bit, well, not a little bit, they'd have a lot of trepidation about doing something like that. And I get it. Listen, you know what? When I would interview CEOs of businesses, managing directors, people of high seniority, or even just people on the street, you're always a little bit nervous about what they're going to say. And that doesn't change even now when I work with heads of departments or CEOs, marketing directors, whoever it may be. I do still get that sense of, oh, this is a powerful person. I've got to make sure that I'm on my A game today. But I think when you've been in journalism, you do sort of see it for what it is, that these are just everyday people. They're just people. It's like we have a saying in England, but I'm gonna amend it for an international audience. But everyone goes to the toilet. It's like no one is like no one's inferior to the next person. No one is like a superhero, or no one deserves to be put on a pedestal. Everyone goes to the toilet. Everyone drinks water. Everyone goes to sleep. It's kind of like they're just people at the end of the day. And I think a lot of people who go straight into a corporate environment where there might be quite a lot of suits and a lot of big wigs and people who think really highly of themselves, people can get really intimidated by that, and they can think, well, this is a really technical subject matter. I don't feel confident in writing about this. I don't want to go and approach this person or that person, especially product managers. My God, they tend to be the most banal, obnoxious and resistant people ever. But if you can really break down those barriers and get them on side quickly, you find out they're just people too. So you might have that impression of them as being really kind of miserable fuckers, but they end up being the source of great content. So yeah, I think that's what a lot of copywriters should learn from people like you and I, who've interviewed just about everyone and anyone. They are just people. And you know what? Even the most resistant people, or the people who seem the most indifferent at first, if you get them on side, you can get some amazing content from them.
Absolutely.
You really can. And I think that really does lead well onto the next question, because if we talk about building close relationships with key stakeholders, what are some examples of great content you've been able to create through doing that? So I mean, it could be anything. It doesn't have to be like a big piece of content. It could be a small story you did, or some web copy, or whatever it may be. I mean, what do you have any examples that you can reference here about where you built relationships with internal SMEs and got some great content from it?
Well, I'm gonna reach back for a minute to my journalism career, because one of the coolest things I ever did there, on my first full-time reporting job, I was on an education beat, and I was covering a local school board meeting, and there was a parent there with her child, upset that her child wasn't getting the help that she needed to succeed in school. And so, I approached them afterward. I got to know them, wanted to do a story, follow up on it. The more I talked to the child, the more I began to suspect that she might have had a learning disability. Mm-hmm. Now, 25 years ago, they weren't as keen about testing for these things like as they are now. So I think it was between that and the fact that it was a smaller rural town, it was kind of getting brushed under the rug and never really thought about it. At my suggestion, her mother took her and got her evaluated, and it turned out that this child was dyslexic. And so what I ended up doing was a whole series not just reporting that this parent came to complain about dyslexia or about her child not getting what she needed, but a whole series on how dyslexia affected education and what educators could do differently. That was such an impactful moment in my early career, just thinking back on that. And that's the kind of thing that I do now with my content. I've worked with companies, mostly small businesses, to write web copy now. They don't think there's anything special about them. And so I take that time to get to know them. And here's where that relationship building comes back into play. We talk, we have a conversation. Who are you? What are your interests? Tell me a little bit about your family. Why are you in this line of work? Tell me more about your hobbies. You get to know the person. And I've written some really cool about us sections on websites. After convincing people, you have to, tell me your story. I don't want to know the story of your company. I want to know your story. And probably your customers want to know too. And, I've just come up with some really cool content that way. So it's that digging, it's getting to know people, it's getting to know, that hidden nugget, like you said before, like going back to the child that had a learning disability. That wasn't even on the forefront when, another reporter might have just reported an angry parent came and demanded more. That might have been the story. But when you know how to dig, you can get to the story behind the story. And I think that's kind of what I strive to do with every client now, whether I'm writing a web page copy for them, a sales ad, whatever it is that I'm doing, a social media post. I really try to take it to that level every time.
Love that, the story behind the story. And, I'm with you. Some of my best projects this year have been the about pages of a website, whether that's a guy who runs a spiritual shaman shop, or someone who helps people prepare for retirement, or a local Spanish tutor. Honestly, I just love finding out who the people really are, because you alluded to it there. People buy from people, they don't buy from businesses, and that's so powerful. Have you ever seen the movie Anger Management with Jack Nicholson and Adam Sandler? So do you know the scene where he's saying, "Who are you?" And Adam Sandler's like explaining, his job and a little bit of like background about himself, but it's all quite trivial. And Jack Nicholson goes, "No. Who are you?" And then he says again, he's like, I can't remember. Am I getting the gist right? I haven't seen the movie in a long time. It's like kind of like, no, who are you? And I love that, because, it's like what we're doing with what we're doing with this, I guess, but also when we interview people, and I'm with you, like I will never write copy for a website unless I interview the main stakeholder for at least an hour, usually 2 or 3 hours, because I want to know the story behind the story. I don't just want to know, and I use this example all the time just because I hate these adjectives so much. But I do not want to see an about page that says, "We are a dynamic, disruptive, award-winning supplier of petrochemicals for," I don't know, I can't complete that sentence, but petrochemicals for the something industry. The restaurant industry? No, that won't work. Anyway, we are an award-winning supplier of this. We are an award-winning supplier of that. I want to know who you are. I don't care about all this stuff. Like, I want to know who you are and how you can help me. And it doesn't matter, in my opinion, what industry they're in. People say, "Oh, well, it's B2B, we can't do that." In B2B, I would want to do that more, because in B2B, usually it's not a case of, wham bam, thank you, ma'am. It's not a quick deal. Quite often these things can drag on for a long time. So you want to know that the person you're in negotiations with to do a 6-figure deal with is a good person. You want to know that you get on with them. It's not just a case of, "Oh yeah, I'll buy that product from your website. I know it's at my front door." B2B, I would argue it's probably just as important, if not maybe even slightly more so. And it also defies what people expect. So if you do a really colorful about page, or you do a really colorful homepage for a local accountant, right? That kind of goes against the grain, because all of that accountant's competitors are just like, "Oh, I help people with their VAT. I help them with their tax returns. I do this, I do that." And you're just reading it like, I'm falling asleep.
Yeah. One of the clients I work with now, they're a nonprofit organization that provides mentoring services to businesses. And I write profiles for them for their digital newsletter of their mentors and sometimes of their clients. And I've had them say to me, these are like, I want to read these every month now because I take time talking to the person. I get to know the person. They're not just a mentor for this organization. I talk about like, what their hobbies are, what they bring, who they were when they were in business, just different aspects of that person. And so it's just, it's not your typical profile that you would read about, a business person. And I think that's one of the best compliments I've ever gotten from any of my clients, is that when they tell you our content was boring until you made it readable. I love hearing that. And it's just something that I strive for, and that's what I'm going to do for everybody that I work with, because that's just going back to those journalism roots. It's that natural curiosity in me. I want to know everything about you. And I'm going to ask you everything, and you might tell me it's none of my business, but I'm going to have a real conversation with you.
I think that you've touched on a really important point there in that last sentence you just said, where it's kind of like you've got to lean into that resistance a bit more, because people are always going to be resistant, and you've got to be prepared for it. If you're prepared for someone to basically say, in not so many words, fuck off, I'm not doing that, like I'm not happy with this, or I'm not happy going into this, that's fine, but you've got to ask the question. You've got to ask the question. If you don't ask, you don't get, right? So
Right.
I always felt that, listen, as a journalist, one of the hardest things I ever had to do, and I'm not sure whether you ever had to do this, was we call them the death knocks, or the door knocks. So when
Yes.
someone died and you had to knock on the door of the family, that was terrifying. I mean,
Yeah.
if you could do something like that, then you can approach a CEO or managing director to ask them a few slightly difficult questions. I mean, if I can tell you now, knocking on the door of a mother whose son had killed himself.
Yeah.
He was 15 years old. Nothing will ever be as hard as that, because I just saw her face pale as a sheet. And then I thought, well, because I think he had brothers and a father, and I thought, I'm about to get punched here. Like I could get chased out of the. I never did, thankfully, but I did have someone tell me to fuck off once. But that was really scary. So, but you have to lean into it. You have to lean into that resistance and go, well, potentially if I'd have got a really good interview from her, I'd have got a great story. And it's the same thing if you have an about page. I mean, it might seem like quite a loose connection, but it's like, okay, you're going to get people who say, I don't want my photo on the website. I don't want anything about me on the website. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to talk about that. But if you ask it in a certain way and you say, listen, I'm on your side here. I'm trying to give you the best chance of getting more clients and making more money. And the best way of doing that is by saying who you really are as a human being. Who's going to say no to that?
Right.
So, yeah. I've lost the questions. That's kind of embarrassing. Where are the questions for? Okay, I found them. I have a load of tabs open and I just lost the questions. So anyway, the 3 pillars of journalism. We're going to focus on what I consider to be the 3 key pillars of journalism. And I don't know whether you agree with this, but I've put researching, interviewing, and shock horror writing the copy itself. I guess they're the main 3. So if we start with researching, what does good research look like, and how can copywriters use research to create content that surpasses the mundane?
Well, it really depends on, the industry that you're writing about, obviously, and how you're going to approach research. But I always include, and you mentioned it a little bit ago, I always include interviews, one-to-one interviews, like we're doing now with key team members in a business, because they know their business better than anybody. They understand their industry. So I'm going to lean heavily on them, first of all, to get most of the information that I need. Not just about their brand, but even just about the industry. So that's always where I start. And I think it surprises a lot of people, especially people that I'm going to write web copy for. If they've ever had it done before, they're like, nobody's ever done that before. They send us this weird questionnaire and we fill it out, and then they write copy that has nothing to do with us, and that's what we get. So, that research phase is lacking a little bit. If I'm writing something that's educational and it needs some data to back it up, I'll hunt for data. I may look at industry relevant publications, first of all. I never just open Google and type in a question, because as you know, nowadays, you're going to get AI generated stuff that it is not even accurate, not relevant. It's kind of a scary world out there. So, you have to know where to dig. Trade publications, scholarly papers, those sorts of things as appropriate. So I spend probably, I would say, easily 70% of my writing time doing research.
Just going back to this, it helps that if I'm not muting myself.
Yeah.
Going back to something you said a moment ago, does that therefore mean that I was wrong to super glue the cheese onto my pizza? Because I thought that's what AI overviews told me I should be doing. So I have to.
Yeah. Although I'm not going to say that Googling isn't handy sometimes. If you want to do the, when you're doing the audience research part, part of social listening, I will get on search engines, not just Google. And I'll type in some queries trying to figure out what are people searching for around this topic so that I make sure that I'm addressing user intent, especially when I'm writing web copy. And that's important. So that's part of it as well. But yeah, for the most part, my research does not look like getting online and just asking Google a question and going with whatever it tells me.
Some of the best. I mean, obviously, you can use things like YouTube, but I love going on Reddit and Quora. I mean, I know people have mixed feelings about them, but if I really want to hear from the people on the ground, I mean, more often than not, just go to Reddit, or I'll go on even more niche forums than that, or I'll just go and talk to people. Like I know people in different industries. I'm lucky to have an expansive network, so never just go with what Google tells you because Google quite often is wrong. Like,
Yes.
do you do anything like that? I mean, what kind of platforms do you use?
Yeah, there's everybody knows Harrow. It
Oh, yeah,
rebranded itself recently and
yeah,
it's worthless now. So that's a shame because it was a pretty good platform. But something I like to use if I'm doing B2B stuff, it's called Help a B2B Writer. I think that's what it's called. It's relatively new. You can
yeah.
go on here and put in a query and say, I need subject matter experts in this industry for this topic. And you get a lot of responses from people who are knowledgeable, who you can call up and talk to. It's great if I need to interview, a subject matter expert. That's where I find a lot of them, to be honest with you. And sometimes I'll just tap my network on LinkedIn. I think I did that the other day when I was looking for something. I mean, what's the point of being on a professional platform if you can't leverage it to find professionals in an industry that you need?
Exactly.
So yeah, there's a lot of ways to go about it that, don't involve just asking Google the question.
I mean, I'm going to be brutally honest here, and you know, you can correct me if you think I'm talking out of turn, but I think that the majority of copywriters who don't do this, who just copy what's on page one of Google or just lift what they see, AI is probably going to phase them out.
Mm-hmm.
The people
Oh,
who go for the unique angles, who go for the different perspectives, who go for the first world perspectives, especially with the EEAT thing, which we know about, and we're going to come on to talk about that. Like people who have that curiosity, in my opinion, are always going to be fine. You've talked about this extensively. Writers panic about Google helpful content updates. If you're writing content that genuinely is helpful and unique, you needn't ever worry about this stuff because even okay, let's say even if your traffic does fall a little bit, but if it's relevant enough, then it's going to be the right kind of people who are reading your content anyway. You might get lower traffic numbers, but you get like sometimes you can see your traffic fall by half, let's say, but the conversions stay the same. Why? Because you're writing things that people resonate with and that
yeah.
people, relate to. And that's, that all comes from being a journalist and knowing, like, I'll tell you a classic example. So I've written about vaping products before. I've shared this on LinkedIn. One of my clients is a vaping retailer. Now, I could write the same as what all the manufacturers say about this product. It tastes like this on the inhale and it tastes like this on the exhale and it has this percentage of PG and this percentage of VG, etc., etc. But I really want to know what actual vapors think about it. So more often than not, I'll dig around on YouTube until the wee hours trying to find any product reviews I can, find customer reviews from the retailer's website and quote those customers. Don't just put 5 stars, love it. Say the name of the person, put verified customer of this, and then, go on Reddit, go on, I mean, not Quora, that wouldn't really work, but Reddit, YouTube, all these kinds of things. I even found some reviews on Facebook of one of the products and I quoted someone from that. I interviewed a vaping YouTuber, to get their thoughts on it. It's like that's how you go above and beyond. Whereas I once outsourced an article to somebody and it was really bad. I'm going to say who the person was or what their background was, but it was really bad. And I thought people like that are going to get phased out eventually because they're not doing anything different. If anything, because we know AI is an aggregator, right? It's pretty much an aggregator of what is already out there. But that's what some copywriters are already doing. So if you're doing that, then of course you're going to get phased out because AI can do what you do a lot quicker. So
Right.
that's my rant anyway. Do you agree with me? Am I wrong about anything?
Yeah, and honestly, it's one of the reasons why I don't scale to agency level, because
Yeah.
I have like one or two people that I can trust, that are quality and that write like I do and that use the same methods I do. But I've had that experience as well, where you outsource something to somebody and what you get back is so bad, you don't want to have your brand name associated with it. So yeah, and those are the people that are going to, when you see the posts that say AI is going to take your job, it's going to take their job, but it's not going to take our job.
It's really important for everyone watching this to listen to what Shari says, because like if you do all of these things, you will be fine. This is the thing, and people think it's this big conspiracy and that the AI is going to replace all of us. AI will never replace people who do these things, because as you said on your LinkedIn post after our conversation last week, AI can't do some of these things. AI cannot listen to what you've just, it might do in time, but right now it cannot listen to what you've just said there and then think on its feet and come up with a series of follow-up questions. You have to prompt it to do that.
Mhm.
So until it can do that, until it can have a normal conversation like this with the occasional use of profanity, mostly me, or pretty much all me on this podcast, sarcasm, dry wit, humor. AI has attempted to do that, and it's fucking awful. So
It is.
until that
It's really
happens,
bad.
it ain't going to replace us. So do what we say. Do what it's that sounds a bit Stalinist, but just follow these tips and you'll be fine. I had a question about deep dive research,
Mhm.
and I think we've covered this already, but if we can just go back to it, let's see what else we can uncover. So you've used the phrase deep dive research before. You used it on our call last week, and I've seen you use it on other posts before. So for any of our viewers who aren't familiar with this term in the context of copywriting, I mean, it may sound quite self-explanatory, but I want to know from your perspective, how would you describe it, and why is it so important?
Well, it's going beyond, expanding on what we said earlier. It's going beyond doing that basic Google search for a topic. You have to find the experts. You have to find research, validated research. So that's the other thing. You have to be careful where you're finding your research, because implicit bias comes into play. Are you looking for research that supports your preconceived notion before you even start writing, or are you truly looking for objective, unbiased research? There's a difference.
Mhm.
So those are the things that I do, when I'm taking that deep dive. And I always like to put myself in the other person's shoes. If I'm writing about a particular topic, I want to know the other side of it. Even if I don't personally agree with it, I want to understand that. And so I'll do a little bit of, digging on the other side of a topic as well, because you can get some interesting insights that you hadn't thought of before, and then you can use that to either boost your idea that you're trying to write about, or maybe you'll say, oh wow, I'm going in completely the wrong direction, and
Hmm.
then you realize you have to start all over again. So it's those kinds of things, not just like I said, that Google search and going with the first 5 results you see. You
Mhm.
really have to, nitpick what it is that you're looking at,
Mhm.
again, going back to talking to subject matter experts. I can't stress that enough. I don't niche down as a writer, because with my journalism background, I feel like I can pretty much write about anything with the method that I use to learn about a topic, and that includes talking to the industry experts. So if you're not doing that with your research, then you're not really researching.
No, I love that, and you've touched on it there. The ability to critique the data that's in front of you is huge. And actually, that's a point I want to make in the context of ChatGPT. I use ChatGPT, full disclosure. I use it sometimes for outlines, and a classic case, and I've referenced this on another podcast, but ironically, I was writing about AI in the food service equipment industry. And I said, please, can you provide some statistics which show the impact that AI is having on the food service equipment industry and how it's impacting the bottom line for suppliers, manufacturers. And it came back with it gave me a statistic that it said came from Food Service Equipment Journal, which is a really big industry title. And I went back. Now, someone who's not worked in journalism, and you and I know, when you were a journalist, if you got anything wrong factually, you were in trouble. Like any
Oh,
data, like if you got any number, or even if you spelt someone's name wrong, you were in trouble. So instinctively, I went back to ChatGPT and said, "Where did you get this stat from? Well, please, can you provide the original source?" And it came back and basically said, "Unfortunately, I could not find an original source." So I then Googled it, nowhere to be seen. Now, a writer who doesn't have that mindset of, "I'm in so much fucking trouble if I get this wrong," because they've not worked in journalism. I'm not saying that people who don't work in journalism are not meticulous, by the way, but it's like, it's almost just like a form of PTSD when you go into
yeah.
journalism. It really is, where you're like, I have got to verify this and verify it and verify it some more. Someone who didn't have that journalism background and didn't know to do that would have just gone, "Oh, 74% of such and such," and they'd have put it in and it would have been wrong. And then their article either wouldn't have performed well, or a senior manager would have gone, "This is wrong. They've never said that." Or even the magazine might have contacted them and said this, and that would be the worst outcome ever. So yeah, that's one example. And having that element of self-critique, not to the point where you're like, self-hating or anything like that, but saying, "I need to make sure I've got this right. My data might not be right." I mean, how often would you get a story from someone who's just like a local goofball, and you look into it and you think there's no story here,
Right.
right?
Frequently.
Same thing.
Frequently. So
Does
yeah.
that did that happen quite a lot?
Yes, yeah. In one of the newspapers I worked for, smaller town, rural area, that happened a lot. And that's something you have to, just in general, people's perception of, a topic can make it seem more important to them than it really is. Nothing was worse as a journalist than having somebody call you up, "I have the best story for you ever." And then they tell you what it is and you're like, "No, that's not a story." Like, how do you tell them, "I'm sorry, that's not that's not newsworthy."
How do you corroborate that info? Like, how do you corroborate all that information as well? And it's like, well, we can't prove this. Yeah, but I'm telling you it happened. It's like, yeah, but that's not. Yeah. Anyway, but we'll move on. So interviewing. I'm going to read a snippet from a LinkedIn message you sent me when we first got in contact with each other. So I'm pretty sure I'm going to read this, but just for the benefit of our viewers, here's what you wrote. "My human first approach relies on my journalism skills. I build content for my clients the same way I approach writing for newspapers and magazine. Strong storytelling, always a subject matter expert interview or two, and having real conversations that dig deep to find that golden nugget that adds value." I thought that was a great message, and it was one of the early messages you sent me, actually. And I just thought, wow, we are definitely on the same wavelength. So, can you expand on that message a little bit and explain what you mean by a real conversation?
Well, I'll give you an example. One of the newspapers that I worked for sent me out. They used to send me out on the most boring stories. And that was I think one of the reasons my editor did it was because he knew I'd always come back with something better, because I would dig until I found something better, because I didn't want to waste my time or anybody else's. On one of those assignments, I just got to talking to the guy, and I don't even remember what the original assignment was, but I found out that he had been a POW. And it opened up a whole other conversation. And then the more I dug, the more I thought, this guy, he needs to have a feature story about, like, he had some interesting stories. And I came back with a different idea for a story. And my editor was like, "Well, that's not what I sent you for, but it's a good idea, so we'll go with it." So, I mean, that's the sort of thing that, that you have to have those conversations. I always found something that was worth writing about. It may not have been, like I said, what they sent me out to cover, but it was always something better. And if you're not talking to people and making them feel comfortable in talking to you, because when you're a reporter, people don't want to talk to you. They're scared to talk to you. They're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing, and then their name's going to be splashed over the front page of the newspaper saying something dumb. That's everybody's fear. So you just have to be relatable too, and be willing to listen. And I think we've talked about this before, just when we've been talking on our own. Communicating isn't just asking that question and then writing down whatever they say. You have to listen to what they're saying to get ideas for other questions or other ways to expand on something they've told you. That's how you find those golden nuggets.
I don't know if you could draw a comparison here, but there's a pyramid thing that they talk about in sales. Not pyramid schemes, but it's like, basically it's quite effective actually. It could be quite an effective copywriting framework where you start off with A and you work your way down to E or F, but it's like, okay, you need copywriting for your business. Why? Because if you get copywriting for your business, then you get more eyes on your business. If you get more eyes on your business, then you get more interest. If you get more interest, you make more money. And if you make more money, you can afford to pay your staff. If you can afford to pay your staff, you can afford to pay yourself. And then if you pay yourself, you can pay your family and you don't lose your home and all this kind of stuff. But it all starts from here. You work your way down, and you can put that in a negative light as well. It's like, if you don't have copywriting, you're not visible, you don't get clients, you don't make money, you lose your business, your house gets repossessed. But it's like one thing leads to another. And I'm going to make a comparison, and this is such an awful thing to do because you've just talked about your really powerful story, and my story pales in comparison. It's like your scoop versus the scoop she tells you not to worry about. That's what this example is right here. Have you ever heard of the Spice Girls? Do you know the Spice Girls?
Oh, yes.
Okay, right. On my first day at journalism college, we were given an assignment, and it was a brutal assignment, but it was exactly like you've described there. They said to us, go out on the streets of Manchester and find an interesting story. You have an hour and a half. Now, to be fair, I was on it with I forget the lady's name, Sarah. So I was on this assignment with Sarah, who was on my training course with me. And we walked around the streets of Manchester, and we were in an area called the Northern Quarter, which is quite a sort of hip area. It's like in New Orleans, where you've got the French Quarter. I mean, I can't believe I'm comparing the two cities because New Orleans is a lot nicer. But this is quite a hip, trendy area of Manchester with a lot of musical history. And so we get to this local shop, and we just saw a guy outside smoking a cigarette. And we had been walking around for an hour at this point. We hadn't found anything. And we managed to eventually uncover what we thought was a pretty good story. So we talked to this guy and we said, do you own a business around here, sir? And he was like, yeah, I own Affleck's Palace, which is like a jewelry shop in this like arcade. And we went, oh, cool. And then I just instinctively thought to ask him, have you ever had any famous people come in? Because I was like, well, this is in the middle of Manchester. We might as well ask him. He was like, oh, yeah, Geri Halliwell came in before one of her gigs once. I was like, oh my God. And it was like the same day. He was like, yeah, she came in and we had a chat, and she told me all about her life and stuff like that. And then I said, did she buy anything? He went, yeah, she got a bracelet for £1.50. That was just such a compelling angle, because it was kind of like, Geri Halliwell buys bracelet from shop from £1.50, or it wasn't said like that, but it was like Geri Halliwell once bought something for £1.50, and it was just quite a funny story, a bit of a light-hearted story, but just the fact that he remembered it so vividly, and he'd had the conversation with her and said how nice she was and everything like that, because obviously at that time, this was in 1998. And the Spice Girls were like at the height of their fame. They were huge. And the fact that she took 5 minutes out of her day to talk to him. So it just goes to show, and I'm just for the record, it's not as good as your story, but it is a good example of how even a seemingly banal conversation can lead to something quite big.
Yeah, and people will read that. People will read about that because they would like that to happen to them. They're thinking, what if that could be me? So, if you're giving people that feeling of that could be me, then you've done your job.
Exactly. So let's talk about the power of the follow-up question. And you have alluded to it a couple of times already. But I mean, I ask them all the time on these podcasts. I mean, the best questions I ask tend to be the spontaneous, off-the-cuff questions rather than the ones I've got written down. And you and I both agree. You even wrote a post about it last week. It's probably one of the biggest differentiators when it comes to humans versus robots. So, I mean, I've written this question down. I don't really know kind of how to ask this, because I'm just reading it now. I'm kind of like, do I want to ask it that way? But I'm going to ask it verbatim and see what you can come up with. What's your approach when it comes to listening to the interviewee and asking them follow-up questions? I mean, is there any sort of specific things you look for, or any techniques you have? Like, how do you approach that?
For me, it's a lot of active listening. And we kind of touched on this earlier. Some reporters and just people in general, they're guilty of thinking that communication has occurred because they've said something and someone said something back. But that's not having a real conversation. You really have to be invested in talking to that person to be able to pick out something. You may ask them the most basic question, and something about the way they answer it just flips a little switch in your brain, and you say, I need to follow up on that. It's how I found out. It's how I found out about the gentleman that I talked about earlier, that I found out he was a POW. I was in his home,
Mm.
doing this interview for whatever I'd been sent there for. And, for the life of me, I can't even remember what the original story was. But while we were talking, I just happened to notice behind him, he had some memorabilia. And it reminded me my father served, and he has some things like that too. So I just, off the cuff asked him, "Oh, did you serve?" And just that simple question opened up a whole other line of, dialogue with us. And one thing led to another, and that was how I got his backstory. So not only do you have to be able to like have that real conversation, but you should also be observant of what's happening around you. How is a person you're talking to, if you're in their home, what are some things happening in their home? How are they reacting to, the environment that they're in? All those things can give you clues on things that you should be asking or, further expanding on as they're talking.
Do you find sometimes, so let's use that in the context of copywriting. So if you're interviewing a business owner talking about their business, and as we've already, covered, it's like, who are you really, all that kind of stuff. But if you're talking about their service, would you maybe look at my favorite thing, which is an award they've won, and you might go, "Oh, you won that award, can you talk about that a little bit?" But then even just from like that one question, they might say, "Oh, well, we got this award because of this campaign," and you go, "Oh, I didn't know you did that, could you tell me a bit more?" I mean, that would that be a good example? Or is there like, I mean, how would you kind of uncover things if you were talking to a company owner? Would you just listen out for little nuggets of information like that, like something they might say in passing, and you go, "Well, let's talk about that a bit more"?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's hard to give examples. You just kind of have to be in that moment.
Yeah.
But you have to be paying attention.
Mhm.
A lot of people are guilty of not really paying attention to that conversation, so they miss the cues that
Mhm.
someone is giving them. That, when I talk about people's hobbies, I always ask people what they do for fun, because that tells me a lot about somebody. It
Mhm.
tells me whether they're a workaholic. If they say, "I don't have time for fun, all I do, I'm always here," or, if they have a really cool hobby that they do, sometimes that can relate back to an aspect of their business. Or, if they volunteer for any charities, that can tell you a little bit about, just their personality and
Mhm.
just their beliefs. There's all kinds of things that you can delve into if you just, if you have the patience to do it, and you know how to make the person comfortable enough to talk to you about them.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you a really quick story, and then we'll move on to the next question. But I remember when I got another door knock. So this was a guy who had died on holiday with his family, and initially I was sent there on the understanding that it would be a factual news story. I needed to find out how he had died, and I thought, really, he's died on holiday, and you're going to try and get me to find out
Mhm.
from the family how he's died? So I knock on the door, and as I say, the proviso was find out all the juicy details. I mean, it pretty much was said in no uncertain terms in that way. And I was sort of sheepishly walking up to the front door, and I knock on the front door, and there again, the mother answers the door, white as a sheet, and he had three daughters, and it just broke my heart. I was 24 at the time, and they weren't that much younger than me. I would say they were late teens, early 20s. And they let me in. I sat down in the living room and I said, "Okay, so I just want to establish what happened here, and if we can get some quotes from you about what a great man he was." They said, "If you want to find out they didn't say the juicy details, but words to the effect of, if you want to find out what happened, we're not comfortable. We don't want a story going in the newspaper about him at all." And I had to really quickly think on my feet there, and I said, "I tell you what, we will just say that he had an accident, if that's fair, because it's obvious that he did. And I will instead go around the room, and I want to know each of your favorite stories about him, because I want to find out who he was. Because I feel like, my editor might kick my ass, but you know what? I really don't care. I want to find out who he was as a person, because that's really what the friends and family of that of him, sorry, the friends and family of the victim would really want to know.
Yes.
They don't want to know that he might have got, decapitated by some rotor blade. I shouldn't say that because I don't know if that's what it was. It was at a beach somewhere on a Greek island, so I just kind of put two and two together. But either that or he drowned. It was something like that. So I just thought, well, I don't want to say that explicitly. So instead, you know what? And when I said that to them, they were lovely. We spoke for, I would say, up to an hour. I think it was around an hour. And I said, right, and they were getting emotional, and it was just, I just had such a great time. I shouldn't really say great time, but I enjoyed the whole experience because I came away feeling really nice about it. And I remember actually because I took a photo album with me that had photos of him, and they were used in the paper. And when I took them back to the family, because they got scanned and put in the paper, I took them back to the family 3 days later after the story was published. It wasn't a front page story, but it was towards the front of the paper, like third or fourth page. And they said, "Thank you so much," because that was just such a nice story. You know, the way you did it was so sensitive to our needs and preferences, and you know, you didn't pry, you weren't, you know, when we told you, we didn't want to talk about what happened, you weren't pushy about it. And I just thought, you know, I got emotional walking away because I just thought so many other journalists would have gone, no, I need to know the details, or they'd have just walked away. But I
Mhm.
decided, you know what, I want to find out who this person was, because that's ultimately what matters.
Yeah,
um
that reminds me of one of the coolest jobs I ever had when I first made that break and decided to switch away from journalism.
mm,
Was I would a local newspaper hired me to write feature obituaries for just everyday average people in the community, that if their family wanted to have it done. So there I was again trying to find something about a seemingly average person. And I came up with some of the coolest stories. And to this day, it wasn't probably about 2 years ago, I ran into the daughter of one of the local gentlemen that it turned out his story was he had built his own house for his wife. And that's kind of what I framed his feature obituary about.
yeah.
And I ran into his daughter 2 years ago. And to this day, I mean, it's been 18 years since I wrote that. She still remembered me, and she remembered the story and said what a positive impact that had on her life. So, you
Oh,
know, it's those kinds of things that you're just kind of like, you've got it right whenever people tell you those things, that your writing has made that kind of impact on them.
wow, that is so powerful. That really is. Gosh, just getting a bit emotional hearing that story, to be honest, because you know, for somebody to remember your name and what you look like just from that long ago must have really meant something. And you know what? I think that the overarching point here, when we talk about the similarities between journalism and copywriting, is that everybody has a story and
Mhm.
everybody is special in their own way. And it is just a case of uncovering that, you know, and that's the glory of it. You know, you can sometimes you'll work with a company and, you know, I don't want to talk out of turn here, but you'll kind of think this is really boring. I don't want to write about this. And then you'll talk to them a little bit and you'll get to know their story and you'll think, wow, you know, that it could be the most it could be the most like everyday thing ever. Like I've said before, I've written about tungsten alloy metal before, you know, so you can't get much more niche than that. I've written for some businesses where I've just thought, I don't really know how I can get a story out of this. And then I have. And it's that to me feels better than the stories that, not that like, listen, I don't discriminate with who I work with, but like I sometimes do feel that the stories that don't immediately leap out at you are the best ones,
Right.
you know, where because some people you'll talk to and you just get on like a house on fire and you know it's going to be a great story, but ones where you really like you said there with the obituaries thing, and you kind of think, what am I going to say? And then you find something like that and you're just like, thank you, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so, well, actually, that I don't know if that we've already covered this. I was going to say some of the best stories you ever did, but if we just reframe it as some of the best interviews you've ever done. I mean, what are some of the standouts for you? I mean, this could be, by the way, this could be from anything from your time in journalism, your time as a copywriter. Do you have any that stand out to you? And if so, what are they?
Well, definitely that one for sure.
Yeah.
Just because it made such an impact, and the person told me about it years later. So, it definitely goes down in the books as one of my best. There was another time, I think I've told this story on LinkedIn as well. Um, I was working on a special tab, and again, it's another veteran story, but I was working on a special tab for Veterans Day, and we all had local veterans that we had to interview. And one of the other reporters came upstairs frustrated that the guy that he was supposed to be interviewing wasn't a good interview. In fairness, the reporter had a short fuse and was not very patient. And so my editor was like, Shari, why don't you go down and see if you just do it for him? So I went down, and the gentleman was very emotional. It took a long time for him to, just to open up and just start talking to me. And just through, asking him everyday questions, I asked him about his family, just things that you would ask anybody you were trying to get to know. And as we progressed along, he got more comfortable and he started talking to me. And again, this gentleman had been a prisoner of war during World War II and had some truly horrific stories about his time as a prisoner of war. And he told me about them. And his wife told me he has never, outside of therapy, he has never talked about that, not even with her. So that definitely goes down in my books as one to remember, because not only did I have the patience to talk to, here was somebody who truly had a story to tell, and nobody was patient enough with him to get it out. You know what I mean? Like I had to build that. It goes back to that relationship building too. I had to build a little bit of trust with them first. Not just walk into the room and say, "Okay, hurry up. Here's my questions. Answer them." Like some journalists do. So just taking that time with him to this day, that's one of my most impactful memories of story that made a difference to me as well.
Well, I've got to say, I don't think I've ever cried on a podcast, but you're certainly pushing me very, very close here. You're trying your very best. So,
Well, I'm
yeah,
trying not to. I'm wearing mascara. That won't go well.
yeah, it's what a great story. Wow. I think just, when you say it like that, and people often criticize or ostracize men of that generation for not being very open about their feelings. And I do sometimes think, well, have they ever felt like they could
Right.
open up about their feelings? Have they ever been, you know, have they ever been given a platform to talk about their feelings? They just came home from this unthinkable, I want to say this unthinkable stuff that happened. That does not do justice to what happened, but they come back from their horrific experiences, and people just expected them to carry on as normal. And the fact that he's never spoken about that with you say, sorry, just so I've remembered it correctly, you said that he'd spoken about it with his wife, but nobody else. Was
No,
that
with a therapist. He'd been
with
in
a
therapy
therapist?
a long
Sorry,
time,
his
but
wife
not with his wife. Like she knew that he
yeah.
was a prisoner of war and just like the basics, but he would never tell her any of his experiences.
Wow.
And if you've ever met a veteran, they don't like to talk about their service, especially in those kinds of situations. So it takes a lot of finessing and gentleness, I think, to just get people comfortable enough to even talk about it. And to this day, I can't believe that, it's one of those moments where you say to yourself, wow, I was really fortunate. I can't believe I was lucky enough to meet that person and hear their story.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, and even we'll never be privy to the conversations that he had with his therapist, but I would imagine that it certainly wasn't easy getting that out of him to begin with, and you've probably done and I know he's had therapeutic work up until that point, so he's probably therefore more open to talking about it, but you've probably done as much in, say, half an hour as his therapist has managed to do in, I guess, several years, and that must have been really hard for the therapist to get it out of him. It's like with obviously it's a big thing in America, the Vietnam War. There's the dance song by Paul Hardcastle. I don't know if you've ever heard it. It's called 19. And if you haven't heard it, I can send it to you after this. But it basically said 8 to 10 years after coming home, almost, I think it was 800,000 veterans are still fighting the Vietnam War. With the amount of men that came home with post-traumatic stress disorder, having never left America before. And then all of a sudden they're in Vietnam and they're watching their friends die in front of them at the age of 9. That's why the song was called 19. The average age of a soldier was 19. And you just think, what the hell do people go through? Anyway, I know this doesn't really have, well, your story has something to do with
Yeah.
the topic we're talking about, but I am going quite off piece now, so I'm gonna bring it back in. But that's an amazing story, honestly. And you should be really proud of that. I don't want to start getting emotional again, but you should be really, really proud of your ability to uncover that story, because I don't think many people could have done. So I think we're on to the third and final pillar now, which is the writing. And this question overlaps slightly with the one that I started with about core copywriting principles. But let's see what else we can cover here, because I'm curious to know, what what are the similarities when it comes to writing for a newspaper? I mean, how is writing for a newspaper or magazine the same as writing web copy for a business or writing a blog post? And what writing advice do you have for copywriters who haven't worked in journalism and haven't written for news outlets before?
Well, one of the similarities is obviously the storytelling. You've got to find that story. You've got to find something to help connect that ideal customer if you're writing for a business. What's going to get and hold their attention? So that's the question you should be asking yourself. So that storytelling comes into play. It's really a lot of just knowing. You've got to know the audience too. And as a former journalist, that you can't really ask questions or insightful questions if you don't know the audience. And that's true when you're writing for businesses as well, especially web copy. One of the things that, that I find happens a lot is businesses have one perception of themselves and what they think that their customers want to know about them. And it's never what their customers really want to know about them. And you won't know that until you do that social listening and do your audience research, which is the same thing that you do as a journalist. You have to know, we all, as a journalist, we had a beat. So you got to know what are my readers that are interested in education or politics. What do they want to see? What angles do they want to see? So you always have to think of it from that perspective when you're writing copy, whether you're writing a news story, a feature story, or, an about us section on a website for a business.
Well, yeah. And I think, again, I've got this question written down, but you've already answered it, I think, several times on the podcast, just because of how insightful your advice has been. You've never worried about a Google helpful content update because your content has always received strong traffic, high engagement, and ultimately got results for your clients. And obviously, when you're in journalism, it got great results as well. As shown with the story, and I still can't get my head around that. The lady who remembered you 18 years later, that's incredible. For anyone watching this who's new to copywriting, how can they, I guess the answer is by following those frameworks, but how can they future-proof their work in the face of AI and Google algorithm updates and all the other things that writers often worry about?
Well, you can't, one thing you can't do is go into ChatGPT or whatever AI is out there and say, write me a blog about this topic, because it's not going to be relevant. It's not going to be found. And even if it is found during search, someone's going to look at that. Is it really what they want to read? Is it what's going to engage with them and help them connect with the brand or with an organization? Probably not. I have content that I wrote clear back when I first started. So we're talking, 2006, 2007, for a smart home company. Back then, smart homes were just a new thing at that time. But I have content that I wrote for them that long ago that still comes up in search.
Wow.
It blows my mind every time I'm searching for that topic and I see my article from eons ago, and it's because I wrote it in a journalistic style. I answered like the who, what, where, when, why questions. I thought about, if I was somebody thinking about a smart home, what questions would I ask? I tried to include some insights in there that you can't find just, doing one of those basic Google tell me about or ChatGPT write me a blog about this topic. So, that ought to tell you it's stood the test of time through how many Google Analytics updates now. Every time they update their algorithm, I see people panicking, and I'm thinking, I always think of that story. I'm like, no, it just, still comes up.
At the drinking age in America, it's still 21 in America for it to go into a bar. Well, in England, it's 18. And it's blown my mind to think that there could be an 18-year-old in a pub down the road from me drinking a beer, and they're as old as your article. And yet that's still on page 1 of Google. That's so impressive.
Yeah, it just blows my mind because, I hadn't thought about that article for years, and I don't remember why. I think I was just looking for, I was doing some research for a similar client, and it came up. That's the other thing. I laugh every time. One of my clients is in a very niche industry. He deals with breeding Jersey cows. And
wow.
so that was an interesting client. I do blogging for him, and I did all his website content. But now it's difficult because when I'm trying to write a new about a new topic for him, I'll start to do my research, and all that comes up is all of my other blogs.
Wow,
It's
that's
kind of
pretty.
cool, but at the same time, it's like, now what am I going to do?
I'm
It's my
curious,
job.
which of your blogs is performing the best right now for that client?
Um, that's among them. That gentleman's blogs, and it's not because there's not other businesses out there that or that use those same keywords. It's because of the way I've written the blogs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Google likes them. Back when they were still doing rich snippets, that's not even a thing anymore. I guess that's actually they've transformed that into that AI oversights or whatever they're
Oh
calling it
yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But back when rich snippets were still a thing, most of the articles that I wrote, those were showing up for they got the rich snippets because I directly answered a question, a user intent question.
Yeah.
So that's by far still one of my best performing content for a client is that.
I mean, I thought I was doing well having articles that rank on page one from 2017. You've gazumped me there. I mean, if I'm still, so I would have to still hold the number one position, or my article would still have to hold the number one position in the year 2035 for, for that to equate to your achievement. So that is pretty amazing. And
I mean, not all my content does that. Obviously, with search results, it's fickle.
yeah,
But
yeah.
so I never panic, but it is nice to see my hard work, and it's just validation that the way I'm doing things will stand the test of time. Everybody's panicking and trying to keep up with the latest way to appease, Google and other search engines, and it's not worth the stress. Just do it, use this method, and it's going to stand whatever algorithm changes that they go through.
What are some of the metrics that you look at? Because, one of the things I look at is click-through rate, because I think, well, okay, we all know this. You can get a lot of shit on page one of Google. A lot of really
Mhm.
bad articles can get on page one, and then the writer who put them together will go, "Oh, we should do more of that because look, it's on page one." But I tend to look more at things like click-through rate and dwell time, and then pages per session. Because if your pages per session is considerably lower than the industry average for a blog post, then it's a pretty safe bet that something's wrong. That you didn't answer the question or you didn't satisfy user intent. I mean, do you look at metrics like that, or are there any other metrics that you look
Yeah,
at?
no, I do. Dwell time is right now for Google particularly is a big one.
Yeah.
They are prioritizing that over pretty much everything else. Getting somebody to your page is great, but are they staying there?
Mm.
And we all know there's lots of reasons why people might click off right away. If you've answered their question immediately after they've gotten there, and sometimes good content does that. So
Yeah.
you have to be careful with, I know when bounce rate was a big thing. Everybody was freaking out about if their bounce rate was high. And I'm like, no, that might actually mean that you satisfied their question right away. And that's all they needed at the time. But now will they come back to your website later? Probably. If they need something else again. But
Yeah.
it's not a thing that means that, you did a horrible job with your content. It could be the contrary. So, I always tell people just take those analytics with a grain of salt. You have to dig a little bit deeper with those too to see, what is going on. If your click-through rate isn't high, why?
Mhm.
So, it's not always bad news, and so
Yeah.
you really have to.
I'm so glad you've said that, because people really did used to freak out over bounce rate. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago when I got into content marketing, some of my colleagues were like, "Oh my God, the bounce rate's really high." And the SEO manager at the time was just like, "Seriously, don't worry about it." It's like if you put schema on an article and you can answer someone's query in that schema, or Google indexes you for the rich snippet as you referred to there, or when it did, then you've answered the question. It's like, but then people know that's a resource to go back to, or if they see it again, they'll go, "Oh, I've seen an article from this person or that person." And there was something else I was going to say, and it's kind of annoying me because I was really like proud of the point I made in my head, and now it's gone. So if I come back to it, we'll talk about it privately. Unfortunately, the viewers won't see it. But so final question, and it's a juicy question. So for the record, do you think AI represents any positives or presents any opportunities for writers? And if so, what do you think those are?
Well, I think it's just like any other tool that writers use to do their job. And if you look at it from that perspective, then, you're looking at it in a healthy way and in a useful way. Um, I think I know we've talked about I used to get so many questions, and I still get a lot of questions from clients about how do I use AI. So I went so far as to put a section on my website about it, and it gets a lot of traffic. So I know it's something that people are thinking about. But what I tell people is I do not use AI to write articles. You will never get an AI generated piece of content from me. How I use it sometimes is if I want to brainstorm some ideas, or if I want some, it's really good at, one thing I will give it credit for is it's very good at crafting a content brief. So if you tell it, I want to write about this topic, but you have to be very specific with your prompt too. I'll tell it what topic I want to write about. I'll go so far as to tell it what I want it to cover in H2 and H3 headers. I get very specific, and it'll give me a really wonderful outline to follow.
Yeah.
And so then I'll start following that outline. I'll say, okay, I need to research this, and I need to find a subject matter expert for this section. So it gives me like a foundation to start with.
Yeah.
Those are the ways that I use it, and the ways that I feel it excels. But I don't trust it. I don't trust it for data of any kind. I know I hear a lot of people say you can feed something into ChatGPT and it'll analyze it for you. That has not been my experience. The few times that I have experimented with it in that way, it gets it wrong. It doesn't interpret data correctly sometimes. It won't find, like you mentioned earlier, if you ask it for sources, or if it spouts out numbers at you, I'll say, where did these numbers come from? I'm very direct. Where did you get this information? And 9 times out of 10, it will tell you that it can't find that source in its database. So in other words, it just made it up. Now, if you or I did that, we'd lose our job. I can make up stuff, sure. But when I do it, I lose my job. When ChatGPT does it, people think it's great and push it out on their website, because they don't know any better. So, does it have advantages? Yes. And I think the writers that are smart about how they use it and that know what its limitations are the writers that are going to, find the most benefit of it. They're the writers that aren't going to be threatened by it. It's the people that don't understand how to use it, how to prompt it, that are going to get into trouble with it producing subpar content that, just isn't going to, it's not going to hold readers in attention. It's probably not even gonna be factually accurate. So, like I said, it's using it the right way. Yes, it does have some purposes, and I'm not going to say that it doesn't. It's not all bad, but the way that the majority of people were trying to use it, I would never use it that way, nor do I think it should be.
And when you talk about the outlines, being completely honest, I mean, I have very rarely got a bad outline from ChatGPT. Now that comes down to the quality of the prompt, and I actually think, one ironic thing which we've not really touched on is you're almost doing a mini interview with ChatGPT. When you're giving it a brief, then you're asking it questions, and people who know how to ask the right questions. It might sound like I'm clutching at straws. Maybe this is another one of my Bikram yoga stretches, but it's it does come down to knowing what to ask. So when I put the prompts in that I'm happy with, I get outlines that I'm happy with. And I don't care what anyone says. The outlines that you get on the likes of ChatGPT, on the likes of Surfer SEO are really good, and they save us time.
Yes.
I mean, if we really want to get bottom line about this, we can still charge the same amount of money because we know how to use these platforms because we've been using them for the last 12 or 18 months. But we charge the same amount of money. We take less time because we're not. Like, how long would an outline take for you for a blog post? Let's say a typical blog post.
Gosh, it could take a couple hours if I had to do research the hard way, finding out what are people asking. And it's not that I don't verify what ChatGPT gives me. I will go back and look, make sure that those are legitimate, topics that people were searching for. But it saves me that hours of work that I need to go before I can even start verifying that stuff. So, it is like you can, if you use it wisely and you use it in the right way, it can be a great tool, time-saving tool. But, where people are failing is they're just giving it a very generic prompt. And then they get very generic output that's not any more insightful or different than anything else out there on the other websites that are covering the same topic. And it's kind of why I get a little bit upset about seeing people selling the prompt templates on LinkedIn. Because if 20 people give LinkedIn the exact same prompt from a template, they're going to get the exact same output. And then you have 20 different websites with literally the exact same content word for word from ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a good way to use it. You have to know how to ask it questions. You have to know how to prompt it. You have to know what it is you're trying to research in the first place. The output is only as good as the input.
Yeah, that's great. I can't add anything else to that, because that's such a great summary. That's it. Shari, thank you so much. It's honestly been a pleasure. This has been such an enjoyable conversation. Where can people find you if they want more tips or want to read more about you and your experiences?
Well, they can definitely find me on LinkedIn under Shari Berg. I also have a business page on LinkedIn, but to be honest, I get more traffic on my personal page, and I'm a little bit freer with what I offer and my personality on my personal page. So people can choose one or the other. And I also have a website, therighreflection.com, where I post original blogs and insights that I do with other people and just information about our industry.
Fantastic. Well, Shari, I was late to the podcast. I sweated for the first 10 minutes. I forgot my microphone was on mute and I lost one of my questions, but you were an absolute joy. So thank you so much. And I'm sure the viewers are going to love it as well.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.